All right. So I'm pretty sure that the last thing we did was the Selma to Montgomery March, right? Right. All right. So let's make sure we're all on the same page here. Dhruv, can you tell me what is part of what's involved in the Civil Rights Act of 1965?
The
Or
Civil
I'm
Rights of
sorry,
19,
64. I'm sorry.
the Civil Rights Act of 1964 prohibited discrimination on all the factors that we all know today, such as race, sex, and yeah, I think it was those race and sex,
Race, sex, color, national origin, and gender.
race, sex, national color, origin, and gender. Those things.
Sex. Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things that I don't know if I mentioned with you guys is that the Civil Rights Act also it includes women in all of these categories, right? So women get employment protection, women get admission into colleges, women get all of that stuff as well. It's not we oftentimes think of it as being race, but it's not. They explicitly put sex in all of the categories and all of the sections that they're dealing with, right, to strengthen the protections for women as well. So that's good. That's excellent. All right. So some of the Montgomery marches. What's the point of this march, Mike? What was the
Um,
point of this thing? I thought we just passed the Civil Rights Act. Didn't we just solve racism?
I mean, racism wasn't solved, and I think this march was specifically to like keep pushing for the African American voting rights.
Right. Right. Alabama, unsurprisingly, Alabama chooses to not really listen to the Civil Rights Act. Of course, shocking. I know. I know. So, yeah, the Selma to Montgomery marches are basically the Black community's reminder to white America that the problem isn't solved yet, that the problem is still going, right? And so they're specifically trying to get voting. Predictably, this thing starts with violence, of course, but it ends without violence. It ends with Bull Connor blinking, essentially, right? And Bull Connor letting them stand down after like 30 days. 30 days. It's not quite 30 days. How many days is it? It's like a 18-day march. 18-day march, right? So after this 18-day march. All right. So let's jump forward in time slightly. Or backwards in time. All right. So the next thing we need here is the assassination of Martin Luther or of Malcolm X. Malcolm X is assassinated in February of 65. Now let's deal with Malcolm X here. Malcolm X, did we talk about him going on his pilgrimage earlier? Or did I leave that off?
I don't think
No, we
so.
didn't. I don't
Okay.
think we did.
All right, so let's make this next number. We can call it Malcolm X assassinated. Back a couple of years earlier, because I skipped it because thematically it matches here. A couple of years earlier, Malcolm X went on his pilgrimage to Mecca, right? Ilha, do you know what it means for a pilgrimage? Do you know what a pilgrimage is in general and what it means for a Muslim?
Isn't it like a spiritual journey, kind of,
Mhm.
where you like walk a lot for Muslims? Like, I don't exactly know the details, but yeah.
It's a spiritual journey. Specifically, it means a journey to a holy place, right? So for Muslims, where do they go?
It's Mecca, isn't it?
Yeah, Mecca and Medina, and it's not like a vacation. This is a religious, a month-long religious ritual. Essentially, is what you're doing. And as you go to Mecca, you basically walk through, the path of Muhammad, like everything that he did in the Quran. As they read the verses, you act it out and all this other stuff, right? And you go through, it's ritualized, of course. And in the part of the Quran where Muhammad gets kicked out of Mecca, you get kicked out of Mecca and you go to Medina. And then when Muhammad comes back, you return to Mecca. Okay, this is a huge, huge, huge deal for Muslims. Okay, it's one of the pillars of Islam. According to Islam, one of the commandments of God is that all Muslims must go to Mecca or go on a pilgrimage to Mecca once in their lifetime if they're able. Okay, so this is a really big, like once in a lifetime, like changing activity, right? I tell my students usually I have a friend that I used to know back in Maryland, and he was the janitor for our building, and he was a Pakistani immigrant. and he came here poor, and he didn't speak English and stuff, right? And his wife also, you know, poor, didn't speak English, and he was our janitor, and she cleaned people's houses for a living, right? So they didn't have a lot of money, and he was old, right? I mean, when I knew him, he was like in his 70s, and his wife got sick. She got cancer, and I was talking to him, and he said that he was taking his entire life savings. He and his wife had been putting money away their entire life for the pilgrimage, and once she got cancer, they knew it was time. So they took out their entire life savings, everything they had. They took him and his wife, their three kids' spouses, and all their grandkids, and they took them all on pilgrimage. Right? My friend Timor, he said, you know, we don't have any money to leave them when we die, and we don't even have a house to leave them when we die, but at least we can help get them into heaven. Right? And so I I tell you this not because Timor is not he's not a member of the civil rights movement, obviously, right? But I want you to understand the gravity of this action, right? X goes on his pilgrimage in 1964, and he has a religious awakening during this pilgrimage. And what he realizes is that while he's on pilgrimage, he finds that the world body of Muslims is a very different body than he had understood. He had never formally studied Islam before. He had always studied under Elijah Muhammad, and the Nation of Islam is this kind of different version of Islam, right? And what Malcolm X finds is that while he's on pilgrimage, he's surrounded by Black people and Arab people and Asian people and people from India and people from Indonesia and people from all over the world, including blonde-haired, blue-eyed Muslims from Europe, right? And he finds that Islam is universal, right? Everyone in the world can be a Muslim. Um, it causes him to have this spiritual awakening where he is going to leave the Nation of Islam and become more in line with what traditional popular Islam is. We call it Sunni Islam, Sunni. Sunni Islam, which is like the primary branch. That's where like 80% of the world's Muslims are Sunni, right? So he leaves that Nation of Islam and becomes Sunni Muslim. Um, when he does this, it causes a huge problem within the Nation of Islam. It causes a huge conflict between him and Elijah Muhammad, because Malcolm X starts to see Elijah Muhammad not as a really, truly religious figure, but more as a man who's using the Nation of Islam to get rich, and he's manipulating it, right? So X gets in a fight with Elijah Muhammad, and the last straw is that he finds that Elijah Muhammad is cheating on his wife and using the Nation of Islam to hide the fact that he's cheating on his wife. And X calls him out and says, "You can't cheat on your wife. The Quran prohibits you from doing that, right? You can't do that." And so they have a falling out. X continues traveling the country, speaking, but he's not speaking as a religious authority. Usually, he's usually speaking as like a social authority, a political authority, right? He's speaking on the issues of race and equality more than he's speaking about issues of religion and faith. In February of 1965, he's assassinated, and he's assassinated by um, some of the Nation of Islam people. Elijah Muhammad's people killed Malcolm X. He was in New York City. He was at a speech, and on his way back from a speech, after the speech, the Nation of Islam guys came up and shot him. The controversial thing here that we need to remember is that Malcolm X's bodyguards at the time saw the assassin come, and the bodyguards stepped and walked away and let the assassin come. We find out later that the bodyguards were actually FBI, that the FBI had infiltrated Malcolm X's organization, and had planted FBI people as the bodyguards. and the bodyguards just let X get killed. The FBI is operating on something called COINTELPRO. I'll type it out here. It's an acronym. It's a long acronym. COINT. Oh, damn it. Come on now. Okay. COINTELPRO. Okay. COINTELPRO. You guys see that in the chat now? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So COINTELPRO stands for Counterintelligence Programs. Drew, have you heard of it before?
Yes, I have.
Oh, well, there you go. So counterintelligence programs, basically what it is when the FBI infiltrates into a group, and then, plants people, or, pays for snitches or something like that, pays for snitches or plants someone in the group, and they infiltrate the group in order to take it down. That the FBI had defined Malcolm X as a threat and had been operating COINTELPRO operations against him. Okay. Did you guys hear in the news just a couple weeks ago when the governor of Michigan almost got kidnapped by that militia of people?
I didn't.
Oh, Mike,
I
plug into
did.
the world, man.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah. Well, it got thwarted because the FBI had infiltrated those white militias, those white supremacist militias in Michigan, and they caught it, right? So the governor was actually never in danger because these guys were there. Right. The FBI does this kind of stuff in like terrorist organizations and stuff like that. So they were basically treating X like a terrorist. So what does this mean for the movement? This means is that when he dies, the Black Power movement becomes massive. The Black Power movement is going to just blow up around the country. Now, I don't remember with your class what kind of Black Power stuff did we do with your class?
We just mentioned it. We never like defined it or anything.
Okay. All right. So yeah, because I think we mentioned it and then I said we would define it later on.
Yeah.
I think that's what I said. Yeah, that sounds right. All right. So the Black Power movement. So Black Power is a political ideology. It's a political ideology that focuses on rejecting white definitions for blackness. You're rejecting the white definition for blackness, and you focus on the inherent power of Black people, the power that they themselves have. Okay? This rejects the idea that Black people should accept, remember all those like psychological impacts that like segregation has and all that stuff, right? We're talking about like internalized racism, where if you tell the kid over and over that the kid is stupid, eventually the kid believes that they're stupid, right? Black Power is kind of the macro version of that. It's a large societal version of that, where if the Black community of America has been told that they're second class for so long, Black Power rejects that and says, you're not second class. You are powerful. You are the center of your own power. Malcolm X has been preaching Black Power for at this point a decade or so. For a decade, he's been preaching this Black Power, and this Black Power message of his has become very, very powerful. This is where Malcolm X's power really, really lies. And his death propels this even further, right? Because he becomes a martyr for the cause, right? He's a martyr for the cause, so it propels it further around the country, and Black communities around the country recognize, and they say, look at Brother Malcolm was preaching Black Power, and they gunned him down and killed him for it. That means he must have been tapping into some kind of truth. Okay, Black Power is especially popular in the North and in the West. Okay, it's especially popular in the North and the West and the Midwest, right? All the areas outside of the South. It's especially popular in those areas. It becomes especially popular New York, Chicago, Detroit, all of California, right? Black power gets connected to the concept of Pan-Africanism. This is another concept that you need. At the time in the 1960s, all of the colonies of Africa are breaking apart and they're becoming independent countries, right? When we start this in 1960, there's like 5 countries in Africa. And by the time we get to 1970, there's like 35 countries in Africa. Okay, so this is a huge movement, and Pan-Africanism is this concept that all Africans should be united together, right? That the entire continent of Africa should be some sort of like United States of Africa. That they should make one big African country. And Pan-Africanism is in the United States, where African Americans start to reconnect to their African heritage. This is where you're going to start seeing people called African Americans instead of Black, right? Because they're rejecting the label Black and they're embracing something different, a new label, right? This is where you're going to see a lot of Black people in the United States start wearing like African style clothes and colors and prints and stuff like that. You're going to start wearing that kind of stuff. And there's going to be a lot of people who are going to say that the African diaspora, the former slaves of America, the Caribbean, and Latin America, that they should be connected to Africa, right? That there should be this like ancestral connection. And it's an attempt to rebuild the ancestral connection that white people had destroyed. Okay? This ties us into Black nationalism. These are linked ideas, right? All of these are linked ideas. Black nationalism is the idea that Blacks should represent themselves. Blacks should represent themselves. They should be in charge of themselves, right? They should have their own police force, their own government, their own cities, their own everything, right? At certain points in the movement, Elijah Muhammad is one of the loudest voices for leaving the United States. And he basically says the southern states should just leave the United States and kick all the white people out, and that they should just be a black country, right? A black country is what they argue. Sometimes the movement looks like that segregationist or secessionist idea. Sometimes the movement is like Black power communities within the United States, right? It has different flavors at different times and depending on who's in charge of this. Okay. Our 2 biggest names after Malcolm X, of course. Malcolm X is the biggest name, but Stokely Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael had been a member of the SNCC. He's from Washington, D.C. And he was involved in some of the sit-ins and stuff. But he leaves the movement. And he moves back up and he starts to work with these like Black Power organizations, identifying these organizations as Black Power organizations. Robert Williams works with him. Carmichael and Williams work together on a bunch of these issues, trying to raise up, Blacks who are going to be taking a more Malcolm X style action, right? Does Malcolm X advocate violence? Does he advocate violence? No. What does he advocate? If a white person attacks a Black person, what should the Black person do?
Defend himself.
Yeah. Malcolm X is very clear about defending yourself. Carmichael and Williams are very clear about this as well. The FBI is very, very threatened by these guys. Very threatened. And so the FBI continues doing COINTELPRO against these guys. Carmichael ends up being thrown in jail. He changes his name to Kwame Ture, rejects his slave name. And he gets thrown in jail. He dies in jail. Robert Williams leaves the country. Leaves the country because of this. This is very threatening to the FBI. All of these ideas are trying to overthrow the white power of the United States, right? The one that's also very threatening is that these ideas are all linked to socialism and socialist groups, right? And these socialist groups want to dismantle the money power system, right? Money systems of the United States. They want to focus on equality of outcome as opposed to equality of opportunity, right? In a pure capitalist system, everyone has absolute freedom, like equal opportunity of freedom, right? To do things. But in a socialist system, it recognizes that equal opportunity is not equality, right? You and I are not equal in many, many ways, right? We're not the same smart. We're not the same beauty. We're not the same ability. We're not the same height. We're not the same whatever. We're not the same income level. We're not, you know what I mean? Like we just aren't equal. That's in many, many ways. We just aren't equal. And socialism recognizes that and then changes the system of money and power in order to create a more equitable outcome, which the FBI finds extremely threatening because of the context of the Cold War. It sounds too much like communism. Okay. All right. Let's jump ahead. 1965. We're going to get the Watts riots. Okay. Watts. This is our next letter. HH, I think. JJ. What are we on?
JJ.
JJ.
I was Malcolm X is killed.
You said Black Power was HH.
Oh. No, I was Malcolm X is killed, so that would mean JJ is Black Power. This would be KK.
Okay, so KK. Let's make it KK. All right, so KK is Watts riots. So the Watts riots. Watts is a neighborhood of Los Angeles. It's a neighborhood of Los Angeles, and it's home to this massive, massive riot. Up until this point in time, it's the largest, most expensive, like biggest, widest riot. They claim that it's the largest riot in the world, but it's not actually. The Tulsa Race Riot was probably worse than this, the Tulsa Race Massacre. But for some reason, white America seems to have forgotten that one. Right? Shocking, huh? But Watts riots, nobody forgets this. It's all over the TV. It's all over everywhere, right? If it's happening in Los Angeles, it's on TV, right? So this basically starts with some police brutality. It starts with racist white cops being brutal to black men, again, pulling over a black family, and then the pulling them over turns into violence. This violence erupts across Los Angeles, and it rages for like 5 days of incredible violence. $40 million worth of damages, 34 dead, massive, massive violence. Now, a lot of these groups that are involved here, tension is extremely high in the country because a lot of the black groups in the United States, this black power ideology is starting to look much, much more appealing, right? Because when you are peaceful, they're attacking you. But when you're powerful, they're not attacking you. This is the idea, right? This is going to cause knock-on effects. Okay, the northern side of the United States, the west coast of the United States, they're much, much more impatient. They're much, much less willing to just hold hands and chant, right? And we don't have Martin Luther King is still operating down south, right? Martin Luther King acts as this like cooling agent, like when Southern blacks are upset and it looks like violence is going to erupt. Martin Luther King is this constant like cooling force on them. There's nobody cooling down Los Angeles. There's nobody cooling down Chicago, Detroit, New York, New Jersey, right? Nobody's cooling those areas down. And so as you're going to see, as the decade moves on, these areas are going to erupt into violence more and more and more. Okay, 1965, the Voting Rights Act. In the shadow of the Watts riots, the Voting Rights Act is passed. This is our second big, big bill, our second big government bill. Okay, so the Voting Rights Act enforces the 15th Amendment. Okay, the 15th Amendment grants the right to vote to everybody in the country, regardless of race. And this is basically enforcing it. It gets rid of a lot of things like literacy tests and stuff like that. It gets rid of those things. But it also, the most important part of the Voting Rights Act is that it has something called special provisions. The special provisions is where the federal government basically recognizes areas of the country that have a history of racial voting, violating racial voting laws, and then the federal government is involved in their elections, right? So these areas are not allowed to change their election law without federal government approval. These areas are not allowed to make any changes to the elections, like the number of ballot boxes or the number of voting stations or voter ID laws or any of those kinds of things, that they have to get federal approval to do this. So this is a map from 2008. This is a map of 2008. All the areas that are colored in are areas that are considered special jurisdictions, right? So these red ones are like entire states, where the entire state has violated the voting rights of its people. The blue areas are counties where they've been doing it. The purple is like township areas, right? Like local municipal governments and stuff. With these special provisions, states can prove themselves that they have been good, and then have this special provision status lifted. They can do that, and new states can be added if new states are found to be violating the rules, right? You'll notice Arizona and Alaska both get added. So does New Hampshire, right? They all get added later. They're not part of the original grouping, right? When this first passes, it's all the southern states, basically. It's 100% of all the southern states. But eventually what happens, Arizona starts doing the same thing to Latinos, right? Doing voting shenanigans with Latinos. Alaska starts doing it with natives, native Inuit people and stuff, right? And so they get added onto the list. Drew, did you have a question?
Yeah, I did. Are there still any states that have special provisions today? Or
Well,
townships?
that is a very smart question. The answer is no, because in 2011, the Supreme Court shot this down. And they shot it down and they took this away. So the Supreme Court destroyed this act in 2011, and we have not passed a new one yet.
Why?
Yeah, the Supreme Court made the justification that the Supreme Court gave was that they didn't think that the federal government can treat different states differently, that all states have to be treated the same. The federal government's defense was, we are treating all the states the same. All the states have to meet this standard, and any state that doesn't meet the standard gets hit with the special provisions, right? They said we are treating them the same, right? The only reason why, Oregon isn't under special provision status is because Oregon doesn't do a bunch of racial shenanigans on their voting, right? Oregon's not constantly trying to undermine black votes. And so Oregon's not being special provision status. The Supreme Court dismantled this. In 2011, Drew, the 2011 map looks almost identical to this map, right? This is a 2008. This is the latest one that I was able to find, but they're basically the same. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. The Voting Rights Act, I forgot, bilingual ballots. It also requires states to have multilingual ballots, depending on how many people you have who speak other languages, right? So basically all states have Spanish ballots now, basically. All states have Spanish ballots, but certain states will have other languages as well. San Francisco, California, I think is the number one. It's the highest one, and their ballots are in 19 languages. 19 languages in San Francisco, because San Francisco is so linguistically diverse, right? I think New York is like 15 or 16 languages, I think. Yeah, but it's, Spanish, of course, is the biggest one, of course. But Chinese, Vietnamese, Tagalog, Chinese, Vietnamese, Tagalog, Portuguese, and Hindi, I think, are the next biggest ones. Yeah. Okay. Let's do our Black Panther Party. So next lever, L, right? LL. LL is the Black Panther Party. 1966, the Black Panther Party is formed. This is in the context of Black Power. It's in the context of the Watts riots, right? It's in the context of this increasing violence. And they're founded in Oakland, California. They're founded by Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, both men who will end up dying in prison. And the Black Panther Party is basically very similar to the Deacons of Defense and Justice in a way, is that they carry guns. They openly carry guns everywhere they go, and they do something called cop watch. This is where they basically follow cops around. They follow cops around and make sure that the cops aren't, being racist and like being violent and being brutal. The cops of California, especially, the Black Panthers start to spread around the country, but California is their home, and they have a real problem with this. We have lots of situations where they get into violent clashes with the police. Then the Black Panthers constantly are saying that the police started it, right? That they were following a police car, watching the police car, and then the police car would like pull over and next to another police car, and then the cops would get out and beat up the guys, right? And the Black Panthers were constantly saying that the cops were starting it, and most of America didn't believe them because the image of like, black men in leather jackets and, like black men dressed up like this and acting like this was just too scary for most of America, right? And so most of America doesn't believe the Black Panthers. As it turns out, they were probably right. The cops were being brutal and the cops were doing this, right? In 2020, it's much easier for us to believe them, right? Yeah. This group is COINTELPRO takes this group out also. The FBI infiltrates the group and gets people arrested. Huey Newton and Bobby Seale are both arrested on some pretty shady charges. And they end up rotting in jail. This prompts California to ban guns, to ban open carry guns. The NRA, the National Rifle Association, the gun organization, this is the founding of the NRA, where the NRA is founded in order to promote gun control, to stop black men from walking around with guns. And once they get that ban up, then the NRA is going to change their tune and become a almost 100% white organization dedicated to making sure white people get more guns. Yeah, that's the NRA we have today, right? But in the beginning, they are starting with this, taking guns away from black people. All right, we're almost done. Ilha's tired. He wants to go home. All right, Ilha, you're already home, man. All right.
My eyes just hurt, so.
No, I get it. This is a lot of information to get real quick. Over these years, these are all the riots that are going to break out across the country. All of these riots. Okay. 1967 gets called the Long Hot Summer. That's what the news calls it. And these are all of these. These are just the riots large enough to be more than $1 million worth of damage. And then they have 136 other smaller riots as well. Right? And when you look at these locations, where are they all happening?
Big cities.
New York, New Jersey, Illinois, New York,
Oh, the
Maryland,
East.
New York, Michigan, New Jersey, right? There's a couple down south. Once in a while, you'll get like Arizona is not part of the South, but Georgia, you get a couple of them in the South, but most of these are happening in the North, right? Chicago goes into riots over and over and over again, right? Chicago does, New York does, Detroit does, Cleveland, all these places. The worst riots, the Watts riot is the single largest one. That's the single worst one. But probably the largest cluster of riots is here in 1968. They're called the King Riots, 125 of them. And they all follow the assassination of Martin Luther King. So Martin Luther King is assassinated in 1968, in April of 1968. He's down in Memphis, Tennessee. Memphis, Tennessee, he's at a hotel, walking into his room, and a gunman, an anonymous gunman, shoots him and kills him. Yeah, Drew?
Wasn't it James Earl Ray who killed him?
Yeah, well, yes, it is. He gets caught later. He gets caught
Okay.
later, but at the time they don't know who he is.
Okay.
Anyway, so Martin Luther King gets killed. James Earl Ray kills him. There is some evidence that there's some COINTELPRO stuff going on. We know for a fact that the FBI had labeled Martin Luther King a threat. We know for a fact that they had done that. We know for a fact that the FBI had been infiltrating his organizations and stuff. We don't 100% know that the FBI is involved in his assassination, but you know, I wouldn't be surprised if we did find that out. After Martin Luther King's assassination, and King was viewed as a threat because after the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Martin Luther King had changed his message. And his message is no longer focused on just racial equality. It's now focusing on racial justice and racial social equality, right? Which means that Martin Luther King is advocating a socialist message. He's advocating for things like universal basic income. He's advocating for dismantling the banks. He's advocating for paying reparations. He's advocating for financial equality. This is where a lot of people see Martin Luther King turns into a threat, something that the US government sees him as a threat. Many people will say that like the banks and the rich companies and stuff see him as a threat because he's changed his message and that they're supporting this. Okay. This gets into some conspiracy theory area stuff. We're going to stay away from that. But I do think it's important that you know that his message has changed, and that's when he gets killed. Right? As long as his message is about like letting little black girls go to school and letting black people ride on the bus, he doesn't get killed. But as soon as this happens, he gets killed. Right? Is that a coincidence? I don't know. I don't have definitive historical evidence for it, but I tend to think that it's not very coincidental. Okay. Couple of months later, Robert Kennedy gets killed as well. Robert Kennedy, we've seen him before. Who was he?
He was the one who got MLK out of jail originally, right?
He did. He's the one that got Martin Luther King out of jail in Birmingham when he was in the Birmingham jail. He's also the one who sent the troops to go protect the freedom rides. Right? Then when they started giving armed soldiers to protect the freedom rides. What was his job when he was doing that? What
Attorney
was Robert?
General of the United States.
Yep. He was the Attorney General under who?
His brother, or wait?
Yep. His brother.
His brother.
Yeah. So JFK was his brother. RFK was his Attorney General. At this point in time, RFK is the Democratic nominee for president. And he's running on a pretty socialist platform. A pretty socialist platform and a pretty explicitly racial equality platform. And that's where he gets killed. He gets killed at a political rally down in Los Angeles. After King gets killed, riots break out around the country. The Washington, D.C. riot's probably the worst. Washington, D.C. burns like a quarter of the city down. This is D.C. This is part of D.C. And they burn like a quarter of the city down. They burn, I mean, it was bad, terrible. Okay. Now, according to IB defines that the civil rights movement stops here. Okay. They define that the civil rights movement stops here. Oftentimes they're going to ask you questions about aftermath of the civil rights movement. Okay. So this is where you can talk about some of these riots, the Black Panther, the transition to socialism, the transition to Black power, right? And it's also important that you be able to at least mention that the black movement, the black rights movement, feeds into all of these other movements. Okay, so second wave feminism is the women's rights movement that's happening all through the 60s and 70s. Right, it's happening at the same time, but it continues all the way into the 70s. Okay, you also have the Native American rights movement, which becomes very, very potent in the 1970s. Okay, you also have Asians. The Asian movement, there's like kind of two Asian movements. One of them is centered around Asian agricultural labor. Cruz and Ilitong are Filipino grape pickers, right? The other one is centered around Asian rights more generally. Kochiyama is a good example of that. She's like opposition to the Vietnam War and Asian rights. The Latino movement. The Latino movement is very, very large, and the Latino movement is very, very closely linked to like agricultural labor, like fruit pickers and stuff like that. You know, Cesar Chavez, he will get assassinated as well. Cesar Chavez gets assassinated. He's a labor leader. Dolores Huerta, she's still alive today, actually. Yeah, she's still alive today. The disabled rights movement starts in the 70s. It starts, Catherine McKee is one of the really early movement people. Her daughter has Down syndrome, and her daughter is not allowed into the schools. And so she sues, basically saying that everyone should be able to be in school. And this eventually turns into the passage of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1991, which is why we have ramps on everything, why we have elevators, why we have, door latches instead of door knobs. It's, making the entire country accessible to people. The youngest movement is probably the gay rights movement. The gay rights movement, which eventually also leads us into the trans rights movement, which is today. And the gay rights movement starts up in the late 60s and goes all through the 70s, 80s, 90s, all the way to there. Harvey Milk is probably the biggest person in this movement. He will also be assassinated. He's the first gay man to be elected into office. George Moscone is the mayor of San Francisco, who was a close ally with Milk and friend with Milk, though he's straight himself. They were both assassinated. Marsha Johnson, a transgender person who was at Stonewall riots, will also be murdered. She'll also be murdered later. Okay. We don't need all the details on these. IB explicitly defines that the civil rights movement is the Black movement, but when they ask you for how does other things happen, this is the kind of stuff you want to be able to mention. Okay. Are we cool?
Yeah.
All right. Do you guys want to go over your outlines at all? Did you want to go over your outlines, or are you feeling okay with your outlines? Or have you not even done them? You're all looking at me like you haven't done them. Ilha, did you do outlines?
Yeah.
Okay. Drew, Mike, did you guys do them?
Yeah, I did most of them.
Okay.
I
Drew?
did not.
Okay. All right. Well, here's our questions. All right. So analyze the role of women in the civil rights movement. We have a lot of women, right? We have a lot of women. What's the big thesis here? Women in the civil rights movement do what? What's the difference between women and men in the civil rights movement? Yeah,
They
Drew?
help.
No.
Women in the civil rights movement essentially organize everything, however, men end up taking away all the credit. And they're
Okay.
hardly recognized.
Broadly, that's a pretty good idea, a pretty good broad idea. Ilha, do we have some examples to support that idea?
Yeah, so like women tend to foster more sympathy than men. So like, for example, Rosa Parks, with her like helped start the bus boycott
All right.
through like gathering sympathy.
Okay. So it is true, but I think Drew's thesis is a stronger thesis that women have a tendency to have these like supporting roles where men take the credit. Do we have examples of women in supporting roles where men are taking the credit over them? Mike, do you have any examples of that?
Was it Ella Baker where she could only be the thing secretary or something of some
Yeah.
organization?
Yep. Ella Baker's a very, very good example. Who else? Joanne Robinson. Joanne Robinson's a very good example of this, right? Bernice Fisher's a good example, right? We have quite a few examples if you start looking for them. This comes up quite often, right? Fannie Lou Hamer is a good example. Okay. All right. Let's look at G, Mike. To what extent did African Americans achieve their goals by 68? Right. This is kind of an overall question. Right? You can say, remember, whenever it's a to what extent question, if you picture your answer in like 5, right? Where 5 means absolutely, totally successful in every way, and 1 means total, absolute failure, right? Are you ever going to answer that, a 1 or a 5? No.
No.
Right? And are you ever going to answer, sometimes it was good and sometimes it was bad? No, because that's not an answer, right? So your answers will always be 2 or 4, right? It was mostly successful except for this. It was successful because of A and B, but not successful because of X. Or flip it, it was mostly unsuccessful because of A and B, or X and Y, but it had some successes, right? That's how you want to phrase it. I think you can come up with your own examples on that, I think, but that's the formula you want to follow. All right. H, compare the civil rights movement in the southern states and the rest of the United States. This is where today's class really kicks in, right? Because today's class, we talk about like the Black Power movement, Nation of Islam, right? All the riots and the violence, right? That's a really, really strong contrast. Cool. Is there anything else missing? Oh, what's the organizing principle in the South? And what's compared to the organizing principle in the North? Who does most of the organizations down South and who does most up North? Who uses churches?
The SCLC.
The South, right? The SCLC most prominently, right? Right. In the South, most of these movements are organized by churches, right? And in the North, most of the movements are organized by who? Labor unions, like A. Philip Randolph, Bayard Rustin, labor union groups. Okay. So the North is mostly labor unions. The South is mostly churches, right? And then talk about the Black Power, Nation of Islam, violence, that kind of stuff, right? All right. I, evaluate the effects of Black Power on the civil rights movement. That's basically what we talked about today, right? A lot of that kind of stuff. And then J, the federal government limited the successes of the civil rights movement. Discuss this. What is some evidence that the federal government limited the movement? Yeah, Drew?
Because of their COINTELPRO activities.
Yeah, COINTELPRO is a strong evidence. Yes, COINTELPRO is strong evidence of the federal government making it worse. What else? How did the federal government make it worse? Or at least not help? COINTELPRO is strong. What else? How about enforcement of the courts? What happens after Brown v. Board? Does the country just let it go? Or do they, the country just ignores it?
Oh, the country just
ignores it, right? And what does the federal government do about that?
pretty much nothing.
Not much until like
for a couple of years at least, right?
Yeah.
Until Little Rock 9. Yeah, so the federal government does basically nothing, right? With all deliberate speed becomes a real problem, right? Okay. What's the evidence you have that the federal government was helpful in the movement?
The legislation they passed, like the acts.
Okay.
Voting
Civil Rights Act,
of
Voting Rights Act.
1965.
Yeah.
Civil Rights Act 64, Voting Rights Act of 65, right? What else? I think the Supreme Court, right? I mean, Brown v. Board, and a couple of these other decisions, right? What else?
Like just like the federal support for the movement, like FDR and the Robert Kennedy.
Yeah. Yep. JFK, RFK, LBJ, right? Truman's executive order,
JFK,
Truman's
not
executive
FDR.
order, right? Yeah, I think there's a good amount, you know, and you can make an argument. You can say the federal government helped a little bit by doing A, B, and C, but they didn't really help all that much because of D, you know, or something like that. Cool. Yeah, Drew.
What would be a good thesis for evaluate?
For evaluate.
Yeah.
So again, you could say Black Power affected the civil rights movement by doing A, B, and C.
Okay.
Right, and you can do that. I have a typo on here. No one has pointed out my typo. How many people have read this thing and not seen my typo?
Typo.
Oh my gosh, how embarrassing. Why can't I adjust this thing? All right, are we good to go? Do we have any questions, problems, concerns? I'm going to fix my typo right now. All right, I'm stopping the recording.